Welcome to the Culture of Violence in Schools. My name is Alita Polly, and I'll be your instructor for this class. The class has been developed by the Frederick Center for Professional Development in an effort to inform you about the types of violence today in our schools. Violence. What types of violence do we have in our schools? What makes our schools so violent? Well, we have more violence in society in general. The media plays an important part in portraying violence in the news media and in video games. We have more access to guns, more stressors in our lives. We have changing norms and values, lots of mental health issues, and a lot more family problems than in years past. What types of violence are there? Well, we're very familiar with bullying. Don't forget the fights that take place in our schools. We have threats and intimidations, all different types of physical assaults. Even rarely do we have rapes. Most often we hear about shootings in our schools. Fights are predominant things. They tend to take place in urban schools as well as rural and suburban schools. When we think of violence, we think of the rampage shootings, which happen as a one last draw that takes place with many, many fatalities. But in our urban schools, we have a lot of fights that take place, often between young men, oftentimes between young women. Where does the school violence take place? As I said before, urban schools, suburban schools, and rural schools. Now, interestingly enough, very rarely do rampage shootings take place in urban schools. Why? Well, there's a lot of reasons. Number one, the response time for the officers to get on scene is very quick because of the proximity to the many precincts that are out there. Also, with your urban schools, the violence that takes place, if in fact it is in a school, which rarely happens, it's usually targeted, and there's a reason for that violence. It might be that a fella's been jilted by his girlfriend, it could be gang related, it could be drug related, but it's usually an individual who's targeted, and most often it is actually off the school premises. In the suburban schools, this is where we hear about our many rampage shootings. These happen most often in schools with the predominantly white students. Um, they tend to be middle class students. And so you have to wonder, why is the demographic an issue? In the rural schools, and I don't know if you will remember, but some years back there was a shooting that took place out in a countryside at an Amish school. We'll take a look at that later. Who exactly is the offender? Well, let's take a look at his profile. This person tends to be a male between the ages of 13 and 23. They tend to be white in terms of the actual rampage shooters. They do have a previous history of school problems. They have access to guns. They are somewhat marginalized, meaning that they are on the fringes. They don't usually fit in with the main group. And they've oftentimes been bullied over long periods of time. What is a rampage shooting? A rampage shooting is a serial killer whose murders occur in a very short span of time and follows no discernible pattern. That is to say, they are indiscriminate shooters. Someone coming down the hallway may get shot. A group of students in the library may be shot and killed. There are some famous rampage shooters, and for many of you, you may not have been born when this happened in 1966. But Charles Whitman, who attended the University of Texas, was actually, I think, our first high profile rampage shooter. We'll learn more about him as the class goes on. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold are probably the most famous shooters of all. Those were the Columbine students who killed 13 students in 1999. We also have another student, Sung Hyai Cho from Virginia Tech. He killed 33, and as of 2007, that was the highest number, but it has exceeded since then. Adam Lanza, Sandy Hook Elementary School, shot 26 students, most recently in 2012. And Ohio's rampage shooter, T.J. Lane, Cardin High School, 2012, killed 3 students. What are the signs that someone might look for to see if someone that they know or have heard of may be at risk for some of these atrocities? Well, number one, these people appear to be depressed. Now, we're not probably counselors or able to diagnose, but oftentimes the shooters have a change in disposition and personality. They're not interested in things that they were previously interested in. They have erratic behavior. One day they may be happy and involved in things, the next day they may be sullen and reserved. Oftentimes they have a prior history of violence. And as we found out, most of these rampage shooters have mental health issues, and we'll talk about those later in the class. They have few social connections in terms of not being accepted into the general social groups. They usually have just a couple of friends that they hang out with. And most interestingly of all, they tend to announce their intentions either on Facebook, in a journal, in some kind of a writing, or just general conversation with other students. It can happen anywhere. College campuses, elementary schools, middle schools, or high schools. It can happen anywhere. So what should you do? Report anything that is of concern to a principal if you're in a school, professors if you're in college, to administration or law enforcement. Your job is to keep yourself and others safe. Document your report so if something happens, there was documentation that you took steps to try to prevent that. Remove yourself from that environment if possible. Evacuate or shelter in place as a last resort. But by all means, most importantly, educate yourself.